Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Please give me a thumbs up to confirm that you can hear me. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It is noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. I am Dr. Sinda Degenhardt, the Grants Development Manager at VirginiaWorks. Today, we are joined by Sophia Johnston and Nora Ferrente from VirginiaWorks to help us attend to the chat. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to put them in the chat. If we have a surplus of questions, we will do our best to address them near the end. The goal of our webinar today is to discuss grant writing tips and tricks in partnership with the Virginia Adult Learning Resource Center. So let's dive in. Oh, and for the record, we are recording so that you may review this recording on a later date as a reference. Today, we're going to discuss grant writing fundamentals, how to make your applications stand out, and how to learn more. The first step to the grant development process is to identify a grant opportunity and a deadline. At the very beginning, when you are identifying funding opportunities, the emphasis here is multiple opportunities. So you want a system to be able to identify whether or not a funding opportunity, a grant, is relevant to you or not. And a really great way to do that is to have a screening system to identify, first off, are you eligible? Is this a funding opportunity that will help your agency meet your long-term goals? And when is the closing date? When is the application due? This will help you identify, is this relevant and do you have time to write an application? You want to use these 4 primary pieces of information to help you screen through several opportunities at once to make initial lists of what funding opportunities are relevant to you. And once you identify whether or not a funding opportunity is relevant to you, what you want to do then is take a deep dive into the documentation. So funding opportunities often are associated with FOAs, funding opportunity announcements, which tend to be anywhere between a 20 to a 150 to 200 page document that really is your instruction manual for how to put together your program and your application. And I recommend taking your time with reading this documentation. It can take anywhere between 2 to 3 days to fully read all of the documentation for any given grant. And when you do this thorough reading, you want to kind of flesh out more details than what you do in the initial screening phase. So please use this chart. This is the chart that we use here at VirginiaWorks to identify key details about funding opportunities and know whether or not they are, first off, relevant in helping us accomplish our long-term goals, and also to make sure that once we do decide whether they're relevant, what are the key components of the application so that we can put together a good proposal? When you are reading the funding announcements, one of the key details that you should really pay attention to is, do you have the necessary accounts to apply? So often, in order to submit an application, you need a sam.gov or a grants.gov account, or really just an account on whatever platform that the grant is accepting applications in. It's really important to identify whether or not you have accounts in these different web platforms as soon as possible, because it can take several weeks to establish your account. So the last thing you want to do is to go through the process of writing an application, spending months writing a grant application, and then realizing a few days before the application deadline that you need a sam.gov or a grants.gov account, and it takes several weeks for that account to be registered. So make sure that you identify early on what accounts that you need and begin the process of creating those accounts so you don't run out of time in order to submit your application. The good news is, while you are waiting for your accounts potentially to become registered, you can work on the design of your project and program. This typically takes 1 to 2 weeks because during this process, you need to ensure that your goals align with the grant allowable activities that are listed in the funding announcement. And you also need to identify key personnel. So who is your internal team that is going to help you write the application, but also who's your internal team that is going to help you accomplish the program activities long term? And what external partners are you considering working with? Once you identify who your external partners are, the next step is to attain your letters of support and commitment. This step too can also take several weeks. Every agency, every organization kind of does things differently. And so you want to make sure that you have enough time to get letters of support and commitment back from your external partners. So as soon as you identify who they should be, reach out to them and begin engaging with them in conversations about what your program entails and what their potential role might be, so that you can begin the process of getting your letters of support and commitment early enough to submit your application. The next phase is the most intensive part, which is the writing and editing, which you can really begin as soon as you have an idea of what your program design is going to be. Typically, the writing and editing phase takes about as long as you have time to work on the writing and editing. I highly recommend that you aim to submit your application at least 1 week before the due date. Why 1 week? Well, you wanna have an opportunity to get technical assistance in case there are any technical issues with submitting your application. If you wait until the day of the deadline or even the day before, I have witnessed websites crash because the foot traffic is so numerous on the day of an application deadline that you risk not being able to submit your application in time if you wait until the last minute, because so many other people are trying to also submit their application in time that it can actually crash the website. So I recommend trying to submit your application at least 1 week before the deadline, just in case you have any technical issues with the application portal itself, that it gives you some time to get help from the awarding agency if something, just in case something happens. Now, there is a caveat here, which is that you don't want to submit your application too early either. And the reason you don't want to submit your application too early is because if you, on the rare chance that you go through this process and you find that you have a month left before the application deadline, I highly encourage you to review the grant documentation again, because what that likely means is that you may have missed a large component of the application process. In all of my grant writing experience, I have never finished a grant so or like all of the grants I've ever written, we have been intense projects that have taken all of our time to write, essentially almost up until the grant deadline with that little bit of buffer space right before. If you find that you have finished your application with too much time, with a lot of time before the application deadline, there's a really good chance that you missed a big part of the application. Another reason it's risky to submit too early is because often awarding agencies will submit additional information. They'll announce additional funding documentation that gives you more updated instructions for the kind of programs that they are looking to fund, and also for instructions regarding how to put your proposal together. So if you submit too early, you run the risk of, first off, having accidentally missed a large program of the application. And you also run the risk of accidentally missing key instructions in order to ensure that your proposal is as relevant to acquire funding. So I know that this sounds like a lot of work, and it's because it is, but the good news is that this is a team process. We highly recommend that you have somebody like me, a grant development manager, to work as essentially a program manager for the grant writing, the application writing process, to be the point person for the primary components of the application, such as identifying the grant, reading the documentation, designing the program, and doing the bulk of the writing and editing. But the good news is that your internal team, your operations, fiscal, and programmatic managers play an integral role in all of the key components of the grant development process. And so your team, your internal team, is going to really help you with reading the documentation, identifying funding opportunities. They'll play a big component in identifying what is the design of your program long term, and they'll help you to attain letters and do the editing and submission process as well. And your external partners play a really big role in the grant writing process as well. Your external partners tend to be subject matter experts, and they'll play a huge role in the design of your program, attaining the letters, of course, because they're who you are attaining letters from, and with the editing process. Throughout this grant development, this grant application writing process, remember to defer to experts for help both within your internal and your external team, and build on what others have done. Often when you are putting a grant proposal together, you really don't have to start from scratch. Often you can network within your internal and external team to identify content, written content that has been used potentially in the past for other grant applications, written content that is used on websites, in brochures, for educational programs that your organization or agency has put together in the past. Find any written content that can help you just begin the writing process to take some of the anxiety out of beginning writing. This is really cliche, but it's true. Don't let perfection be the enemy of the good enough. Gather whatever written content you can find that is relevant to the sort of proposal that you are putting together, the program that you are designing, and use that to help you put something on paper so that you can begin the process, which is often the hardest part, is beginning the writing process. Once you have something on paper, it becomes much easier to critique it and edit it moving forward. So don't forget, defer to experts for help and use your resources. Use the resources that you have available to you. Okay, great. Now we're going to go into some grant writing fundamentals. Often when you first find a new funding opportunity, they're typically posted on websites such as grants.gov, where they will post a list of who the eligible applicants are, as you can see here. So here they're listing, public and state controlled institutions of higher education, et cetera, with some additional information on eligibility. In addition to the websites that post funding opportunities, often just listing who is eligible, you can also find eligibility information in the funding announcements for each grant itself. That FOA funding opportunity announcement document that can be up to 200 pages is your instruction manual. Take a look at the table of contents. Often there will be an eligibility information section. And if you go to it, it tends to be really helpful because it not only shows you who is eligible for the funding opportunity, but it also gives you information about who isn't eligible for the funding opportunity. So really pay attention to whether or not your agency or organization is eligible based off of whether you are one of the eligible entities listed on the funding documentation and on the website. In addition to that, there are often several additional minimum eligibility requirements that if you don't meet, Your application may not be looked at all, such as the formatting. Is your font, text size, and word spacing what it should be based off of the funding documentation? Is there a fund match requirement? And do you meet it? Do you meet the threshold for the match requirement, which is typically they'll give you a percentage, so they'll say something like, oh, uh, hello, can you hear me? I seem to have,
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, no,
okay, great.
now it's okay. Now it's
Okay, great. I seem to have been kicked out of the meeting, but I'm back now. Okay, hopefully you didn't miss much of what I said, but I was describing what a match requirement is. A match requirement, often they'll tell you in the grant documentation, a percentage of how much of the total funds you must come up with from other sources. So they'll say our match requirement is 20% of the total funds. And so you need to come up with other sources of funding to meet that 20% requirement. Do you have the required partners? This isn't always a requirement, but sometimes a funding opportunity will tell you you need to partner with XYZ organization in order to be eligible for these funds. Often there are budget cost limitations, so there may be a limit to how much of the funds can be used for administrative or indirect support, for instance, and there will be limitations to what sort of activities the funds can support. And of course, you need to make sure that you include all the application components. What's really tricky about this is that these minimum eligibility requirements are not usually listed in the same part of the funding documentation. And so you really need to make sure that you read the documentation thoroughly to ensure that you don't accidentally miss anything. It It is really unfortunate to work on a grant application for months and you could have the best proposal in the world that anybody has ever read and then be disqualified on a technicality. So it's really, really important, and I cannot stress this enough to make sure that when you are in the reading phase, that you make sure that you read every single word on that grant documentation and make sure that you are not the only one reading the grant documentation. Have at least one other person at your agency reading the documentation with you so that you don't accidentally miss any of these eligibility requirements to ensure that you don't get disqualified on a technicality. Now we'll discuss some common application mistakes to be aware of. As I mentioned earlier, there is the risk of not meeting the minimum eligibility requirements. Some common mistakes that we have seen in the past in our applications and that we know are common mistakes in other applications are having missing letters of commitment from key proposed partners. So if you have a proposed partner mentioned in your project narrative and your proposal narrative, but you don't have a letter of support from them, that can be seen as a huge weakness in your application. Also, if you have a letter of commitment or a letter of support from a partner, but it isn't signed, that letter of support or letter of commitment may not be considered valid. So make sure that you reach out to your partners early enough in time to get signed letters of support and commitment. And again, issues with application formatting, missing labels, having incorrect spacing, font size, margins. If your pages are not properly formatted, it really impacts readability. It makes it harder for the reviewer to review your document and ensure that you have all of the required components. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, this this can get your application disqualified on a technicality. That does not always happen, but it depends on the number of applications that they receive. I see a hand raised. Jackie?
Yes. Is there like a certain template or something that we could use for
Yeah,
this?
yeah, that's a really great question. I will get to that. Um, Often for the budget component of a grant application, you may be provided a template for the budget. When it comes to learning what a good template is for a project narrative, what I highly recommend is that you actually reach out to applicants that have been successful at receiving funding to ask to see their proposal. The best way to learn how to write a successful grant application is to see other successful grant applications and ideally multiple. So I'll discuss later on in the slides how to do that and recommendations for how to approach successful applicants to receive this information. It's becoming more and more common for the budget component, for there to be templates for the budget component, but there really isn't a standardized template for the project narrative because I think that section is the most, it's the part of the application that needs to be the most specialized on a program by program basis. But the best way to get that sort of template or an idea of what is a good proposal is to see past successful proposals. So other common application mistakes to be aware of are having insufficient detail regarding your sustainability plan, which describes your long-term goals for maintaining your program, your program after the funding ends, and failing to have enough detail regarding your project goals and how they pertain to key data metrics, as well as insufficient detail regarding past performance if they ask for that. I also highly recommend that if there are recommendations that are mentioned in the grant documentation that are not requirements, that you highly consider and do your best to apply the recommendations that are given to you. Often the grant documentation will tell you what is required in clear language, and then it'll give you some recommendations that you may feel are optional, but if you apply those recommendations, it will really help your application to stand out. Those recommendations really give you key hints regarding what it is that the awarding agency is looking for. Another thing I cannot stress enough is to review the scoring rubric. That grant documentation, the funding announcement, often has a scoring rubric that is organized by section. And in that scoring rubric, often there are key questions that you should and must address in each of the sections. Make sure that you answer each of those questions and pay attention to the point distribution. So how many points each section is being given gives you a hint about the importance of each of the sections, which gives you a hint regarding how much time and effort you should put into each of the sections. So now we're going to discuss common application components and tips for each component. So often there's a program overview or abstract where you should summarize your proposal. Not every application requires a program abstract, but if a abstract is required, it's really important that you nail it because often it's the first thing that the reviewer reads, and so it really impacts their perception of your proposal and what it is that you are doing and why. Next is the project narrative, which is the bulk of your proposal. It's the detailed project description. And within the project narrative, often there's a statement of need where you should use data to describe the need for your program. There you'll list your program goals, your expected outcomes, your partners and what their roles are, a timeline, and a sustainability plan. The next main section is the budget narrative, which includes a line item budget that breaks down the calculations, how your funds will be used, and your letters of commitment and support from your proposed partners. So with the abstract, your goal is to summarize your proposal, and the key components are your statement of need, your program goals, your expected outcomes, and your partner roles. And what I highly recommend is that you use data to describe the need for each of the needs that you present. And you want to couch your program goals, your expected outcomes, and your partner roles into your statement of need. So you want to always refer back to your statement of need and why what you are doing addresses the need that you are addressing. And so here's an example here. So my primary goal is to prepare my garden for spring. My statement of need number one is that I must design my garden The data number one is that the data shows that plants must get the right amount of sunlight and must be planted at certain times. Program goal number one is that I will identify what plants will do well in my garden and when to plant. Expected outcome number one is that proper planning will ensure that my garden is beautiful and bountiful. And partner roles number one is that my partner, an expert gardener, will guide my design. And so you can see here how I've couched the data, the program goal, and the expected outcome in partner roles to the statement of need by organizing it in this way. So on this next slide, what I'm showing you here is that what it looks like on a macro scale when you have multiple needs and multiple goals. What you do is you list your primary goal at the top. I need to prepare my garden for spring. And you want to list all of your statements of need in order. So I must design my garden and prepare the soil. This first section up here is the example that we addressed on the previous slide. And then we will mirror this structure with the second statement of need. I must prepare the soil after this first section, mirroring the same structure. So data 2, the data shows that certain plants prefer different soil pH levels and nutrients. Program goal 2, I will test the soil pH and nutrient levels and amend the soil as needed. Expected outcome 2, my fruit and vegetable harvest will be bountiful. Partner roles 2, my partner will help me amend the soil. And so in this way, by structuring it in this way, you are tying your data, your goal, your expected outcome, and your partner roles back to the statement of need. And so it is a very succinct and clear way to summarize who you are, what it is that you're doing, who your partners are, and how all of the efforts that you are doing throughout your program address the needs of the needs of your program, or why your program is so needed. In the project narrative, this is where you describe your project in detail. And if this looks really familiar, it's because it is, and it should be. Your project narrative should mirror the abstract. Really, your abstract should mirror your project narrative. In the reading process, the reviewer will read the abstract first before they read the project narrative, but in the writing process, you will actually write the project narrative first, and then when you're done writing your project narrative, you always write the abstract last because it is a summary of the key components from your project narrative, these key components specifically that are boxed in right here. The difference between your abstract and your project narrative, however, is that your project narrative must be more detailed. Make sure that you cite your data, and for each of the goals mentioned that you outline the deliverables. So what it is that you will actually be doing or creating and relative to each goal. Explain how your goals will be accomplished and describe the challenges that you face and how you will overcome them. And don't assume that the reader will understand what you are talking about. Spell out any acronyms, be thorough, write as if you are reading to somebody that does write as if you are writing to somebody that doesn't have any background knowledge about your expertise, about what it is that you are doing, because they may not. And make sure to tie back your goals to your statement of need. Why are your goals important? I really stress this in the abstract, and it's a detail that can be lost in the project narrative because there are so many components. But if you are not redundant, it becomes very difficult for the reviewer to remember key details. So be redundant. Redundancy is a superpower when it comes to writing applications. The more redundant you are, the easier it is for the reviewer to remember what it is that you are doing. And there is redundancy built into the way that applications are structured on purpose. So just to show you what I mean here, these are different components of your project narrative. Your statement of need in red, your program goals, your partners section, an evaluation plan, a sustainability plan, and a timeline. All of these sections that are bolded are sections that we discussed in detail in the abstract. Your program goals, your expected outcomes, your partner roles that are repeated in different components of the project narrative, but relative to that section. So in your statement of need, you embed your statement of need with your program goals, your expected outcomes, your partner roles. In the program goals section, of course, you describe your program goals again and your deliverables for each goal. The reason it's structured this way is so that the reviewer can just go to your program goals section and have a list of what your program goals are. You want to make your application scannable. And in order to make it scannable for the reviewer to find what it is that they're looking for, you want to be redundant. Now we'll discuss the sustainability plan. In the sustainability plan, this includes sustainable program initiatives if possible, and discuss, and that may not be possible, and that's okay. If you do have sustainable program initiatives that can continue once funding ends, you want to describe how it's going to continue, whether or not that means additional funding is needed. If additional funding is needed, you want to describe a plan to discuss how alternative funding will be acquired. If this is not relevant, there are many programs that are designed to end once the funding ends, and that's okay. If that is how your program is designed, you want to have a plan for program closeout. So how will you ensure that your program meets its goals? How will you ensure that at the end of the program, you have a proper review of the program and that you have a plan for ending the program to ensure that all of your goals are met, that all of your partners have accomplished all of their goals, and that all of the intended people that you are helping are getting that got the help that you meant to give them, and continue to have resources to be able to move forward with their goals. The next key component of the project narrative is the timeline. So in your timeline, you want to make sure that you mark key milestones, that you include in your timeline your partner roles and when your partners will be involved in different roles, and you want to use a visual. I also really want to stress that you want to be feasible. With applications, you're kind of balancing being innovative and being realistic. You do not want the reviewers to have any doubt that what you are proposing is something that you can accomplish. While you want to propose work that is highly needed and potentially highly innovative, it needs to be work that you can convince the reviewers is work that you can do well and that you have assembled the best team for. So yes, be innovative, but do not be too ambitious, because if it isn't believable that you can do the work, you are hurting yourself in the application process. It becomes more difficult to receive funding if you are too ambitious. When it comes to using a visual, you can use a timeline such as the one that we reviewed at the start of this webinar, but I highly recommend Gantt charts instead, which is designed. Here's an example Gantt chart over here. Gantt charts are really great because they're stackable. If you tried to stack all of this information into this other kind of timeline, it would become very difficult to read very quickly. Whereas with the Gantt chart, you can have a list of different components of the program. You can organize it by different partners. You can color code it by partner or by different component of the project. And it's very easy to read. It's very straightforward. You can add more to it. I recommend having, if you are using a longer Gantt chart, try to get it to all fit on one page, just because it becomes less, if you have to flip the page in order to see the rest of your timeline, it becomes more difficult for the reviewer to integrate into their concept of what it is that you are doing. So that is the only caveat, is don't make this multiple pages if you can avoid it. You might want to have a larger, more detailed version of your Gantt chart for your internal team to track when you are actually following through with accomplishing program goals. But when it comes to the application side of things, it actually is better to err on the side of simple is better. Now we'll discuss the budget narrative. The goal of the budget narrative is to break down the calculations used regarding the funds. The budget narrative is often described as being a line item budget with a budget narrative component, which is a description of each item. Often this is the same document. So this sounds like two different things, but often they're the same document. And what that typically means is you want to list you want an itemized list of what you are planning on spending funds on with a description right next to that list. And Speaking of templates, as mentioned earlier, it's very common for awarding agencies to provide templates. If you are provided a template, use it. Often this is one of those recommendations that's really more of a requirement. If you are given a template to use in an application, use the template because it will ensure that you don't accidentally miss any key components to the budget, for instance, but it also ensures that it's in a standardized format that is easy for the reviewer to read. Make sure that you include calculations showing how your funds are utilized. And please make sure that your budget narrative is consistent with your project narrative. Whatever funds that you describe, whatever components of the project that you describe spending funds on in your project narrative, make sure it's reflected in the budget narrative. If these two don't match, your application could be disqualified. Also, make sure that in your budget narrative that your math adds up. This can disqualify your application as well. The last thing you want is to accidentally have a miscalculation and then have your application disqualified because of a simple miscalculation. So quadruple check your math before you submit your budget narrative. Next, we'll discuss the letters of commitment and support. In your letters, you want to provide a consistent description of your partner roles and of your agency or organization's relationship with your partner. Make sure, just like the budget narrative, make sure that your letters are consistent with your project narrative. If your letters are not consistent with your project narrative, what it shows is that you and your partners were not communicating well throughout the writing process, and that doesn't bode well for your application. We highly recommend that you provide your partners with templates, but what you don't want are 10 identical letters of support or commitment. So please create a different template for each of your different partners. Most people understand that when they're asked to write a letter of support or commitment and they're given a template that it should be tweaked, but don't assume that people will do that every time. There is a chance if you give people a template that they will just fill in the missing information and not tweak the wording that you provide for them. And so to avoid having 10 identical letters of support or commitment, make sure that you provide a different template to each of your partners ahead of time. It's really important when you are asking people for help that you make the help that you are asking for as easy as possible for them to provide to you. And there is a difference between a letter of commitment and a letter of support. In a letter of commitment, your partners are expected to play an active role where you want to detail what your partnership is and how you will be working together. Are there accountability checks? What are they? What is the frequency of your meetings? What milestones and deliverables is your partner responsible for contributing to the project? And how will you ensure that they follow through with these deliverables and milestones? That should be in your letter of commitment. So here's an example template for a letter of support or commitment. We at Candy Co. are committed to partnering with the Dentists of America on this initiative to increase fluoride use. We have an extensive history of working with Big Sugar on these successful initiatives, spreading cavities to increase fluoride use. To accomplish our goals of maximizing profits, we will provide sugar services at these key time points every 10 minutes. We will engage in frequent meetings every day and we'll track these key data points, cavities created to ensure that project goals are met. So provide a template and make sure that make sure to tweak it for each of your partners and have those key details in there. So now we'll take a step back. Where do you go? How do you search for grants? What you want to do is subscribe to our Virginia Works monthly grant opportunities digest. If you are not subscribed already, it is a opportunities digest that we release on a monthly basis that shares workforce development and educational funding opportunities. Please email me if you would like to receive this digest. Other great resources for finding new funding opportunities are grants.gov, sam.gov. You can also find grants on the grantportal.com and grantwatch.com. And use this template when you are reading funding opportunities to make sure that you understand whether or not this is something that interests you, and if it is something that interests you, what the key details are to put an application and a program together. I also want to share some other additional resources with you, courtesy of the U.S. Department of Labor. There's the grant. I will share these documents with everybody in this webinar today. So there's the grant application pre-submission checklist. That is a checklist of details, a lot of which that we've discussed in this webinar. Have you read the funding announcement? Do you have a sam.gov or a grants.gov account, etc.? Keep in mind that these materials were created by the U.S. Department of Labor, and so they're tailored to be specific to U.S. Department of Labor grants. But so not everything in these documents will be relevant to every grant that you apply for, but it's a great starting place. There's the grant readiness checklist that talks you through the program design and financial management, for instance, concepts that you need to consider in order to identify whether or not you're ready to start a new program. And there's a sustainability plan checklist that talks you through how to write a good sustainability plan section. So describing your sustainability approach, how to create your plan, and then how to actually write it out. Now we're going to get to the fun part, which is how to make your application stand out. So first, you want to be prepared. And you want to ensure that your application is easy to navigate, that it looks good, and that it's memorable. To be prepared, start early. Keep an ongoing list of your accomplishments. You never know when a funding opportunity will present itself. It, at any minute, a new funding opportunity might be created or announced that is super relevant to your long-term goals. And so it helps to have an ongoing list of your accomplishments and to be mindful of what additional performance metrics or what things that you are tracking or what things could you be tracking in order to ensure that your the programs that you run are successful. This will really help you in the writing process, and it will help convince the reviewer that you are the right person to do the work that you are proposing to do. And of course, keep an eye on forecasted opportunities. Sometimes opportunities are announced early, meaning that what it means to be forecasted is when an opportunity is announced early to let people know that it's coming. It isn't available yet, but that it might be coming on this expected date. And often when an opportunity is forecasted, they'll give you an expected announcement date for when it should be available. So keep an eye on forecasted opportunities. Make sure that you know when they should be announced and when you expect them to be announced. Check to see if they are. Sometimes there are delays, but it's good to keep an eye on these things. And as mentioned earlier, read the documentation carefully and multiple times. Have a buddy, have multiple buddies, have several other people other than you read the documentation with you to ensure that you don't accidentally miss any key details. And educate yourself about the opportunity. Often there will be webinars and workshops about specific funding opportunities. Attend as many of those as you can. This is a really great opportunity to ask questions if you have any, especially once you've started the writing process. And look for successful examples. So earlier it was asked if there are any templates for how to write a good grant. The best way to do this is to find what kind of projects were successfully funded. This will give you an idea of whether or not the kind of project that you are proposing is relevant to the funding agency that is providing the funds. And once you have an idea of what kind of projects were successfully funded, try to identify specific applicants that are the most relevant to the kind of work that you do and ask to see their applications. This this part sounds really awkward, but it doesn't have to be. I don't recommend a cold email asking people to see their applications. What I recommend that you do is you identify a successful applicant and you send them a very kind email that says that you have that congratulates them for achieving this award that says you are interested in learning from them and that you would love 5 to 10 minutes of their time to learn from them. And from my experience, people love talking about their successes and people love to help. So if you reach out and you just say, congratulations on this opportunity. I think your program is amazing. We are trying to accomplish XYZ at our agency or organization. I'd really just love 5 to 10 minutes of your time. And then once you are talking to them face to face, that is when you ask to see their application. It's always better to ask face to face, whether it's in person or on an e-meeting. Once you ask to see their application, they will very likely say yes. In all of the grants that I've ever written, nobody has ever said no to providing their application. And often people are really very helpful and you want to do this actually multiple times. You want to do this multiple times and have a few successful examples of a successful application because the best way to learn how to write a good application yourself is to identify common patterns across multiple successful applications and then make sure that your application copies those common patterns to ensure that you are hitting all of the strong points of those applications. This will make your application much, much more likely to succeed. The next part is to make sure that your application is easy to navigate. Label your sections how the sections are labeled in the grant application guidelines. You want to be creative. Being creative is good, but do not be creative with your section headers. You want to use section headers that are standardized to what is actually in the grant documentation and make sure your subsections are easily distinct from the main headers. You want the reviewer to be able to scan your document and as a reviewer, if they're thinking, okay, I need a refresher on what their program goals are. You want to have a program goals section so that when they're scanning for your program goals, they can find it quickly and easily. Have plenty of white space to ensure readability. Use white space. Have space between your paragraphs, have space between your sections. Do not have long rambling paragraphs. If you have a paragraph that takes up the whole page, it becomes very daunting for the reviewer to read. And I just break up your paragraphs into small digestible sections that are separated with white space. The white space and the broken down paragraphs psychologically make your application just so much easier to read, and it literally gives breathing space to the reviewers so that as they're reading your application, they don't feel daunted by looking at a wall of text on your page. This really matters. The way that the reviewer feels when they are reading your application and how easy and how scannable your application is makes a big difference in how your proposal is perceived and in how navigable your application is. You want to bold and underline your key goals and points and metrics. As I mentioned earlier, this will really help with making your proposal scannable, which is vital to allowing the reviewer to refresh themselves on key details of your application. Remember, they're reviewing several applications in a day, even. And so you want to make sure that your application looks nice, that it's easy to read, and that they have a way to scan it to refresh themselves of key details instead of having to dig through text that all looks the same on every page. If you're showing data, if you have figures, make sure that your figures are high resolution and make sure that the text in the figures is large enough to view. If you have a blurry image in your application, it just looks sloppy. What it shows to the reviewer is that you didn't take the time to find the original version or the high resolution version of the image. At best, in worst case scenario, what it means is that you don't have the high resolution data figure. And then the reviewer might be wondering, well, why don't they have their data? Who has their data? If you are running a program and you are running a program well, you should be on top of your data, you should have access to it, and so you want to make sure that your application reflects that. And if you have text that's too small to read, there's no point in even including it in the figure. So it's better to have a simple figure that has less text in it than to have a more complex figure with a lot of text that's too small for the reviewer to read. So here's an example from my thesis that I wrote a long time ago, where I essentially have a wall of text here. I used a unique section header that seemed like a good idea at the time, and I have a subsection header, but from far away, it doesn't really look all that distinct from the actual header that I thought was a good idea at the time because I'm creative. So now here, this is what this looks like if we apply all of the hints on the left. I changed the creative header to a standardized header that is easy to find. I changed what the subsection header looks like so that it is distinguishable from the primary header. I added some white space in between so that the reviewer can breathe, and it aligns the left side of the page, which looks a lot better. And then I bolded the key sections of this paragraph so that it's scannable for the reviewer. Once you apply all of these changes, the final cherry on top is to align your edges. Align your edges, make sure that your text is lined up and that whatever figures that you include in your application is also lined up with the text. This makes a big difference. Look at where we started on the left and where we ended up. So be memorable, be redundant, be organized, be recognizable, use logos, use figures, visual aids, use timelines, Gantt charts, organizational diagrams, but only if they're good, they're high resolution, and that they're clear and easy to read. You don't have abbreviations in them. And if you do have an abbreviation because the text would be too large to include in the figure, have a legend underneath the figure that describes what the abbreviation is, because you don't want the reviewer to have to scan through several pages back to figure out what an abbreviation is on a figure 3 pages forward. You also want to contact your program officers early on and throughout the process. This really helps with being memorable. This shows that you care and that you're patient and that you want to learn. Contact them early on, ask for help, approach them from the perspective of a learner, and have a positive attitude while you're doing this, and they will remember you and your application in a positive light. And it gives you an opportunity to actually learn from them, to get information while you're working on your application that might really help you. People want to work with interested people. So the secret is, of course, to have a good proposal and to be well thought out, but it's that's one of the but you really want to nail that you care, and the best way to show that you care, in addition to being careful and diligent and putting your application together, is to reach out to them early on. Once you submit your application, reach out to the program officer again to thank them for all of their help and their guidance. Let them know that you've submitted your application and that you are excitedly waiting to hear from them. Thank them for the opportunity to learn from them and to apply to the program. All of these little points of contact really help make you and your application more memorable. And it shows you in a more positive light. How to learn more. In order to learn more about grant writing in general, be a student of grant writing. Attend these sort of webinars and workshops, read the documentation. There are so many different kinds of grants and funding opportunities out there. There are new funding structures being invented all the time. Be curious, attend webinars, go to conferences, talk to your peers, ask people from other organizations what they're doing for funding. Try to learn in different ways and just talk to people about what they're doing and see if you can apply different techniques that you hadn't considered before. It also really helps to review grants when you can. That way you get the opportunity to be on the other side of things. In order to learn how to write, you want to write a lot. In order to learn how to write grant applications, you need to write a lot of grant applications. It also helps you to review grant applications on the other side of things because it gives you perspective on what it is that it gives you perspective on the process that applications go through in order to be considered for funding. write prolifically, and use AI. Use the resources that are available to you, everybody. Use AI to help you with research and editing. But I do have to tell you, AI is a great tool, but it can be wrong. So if you're using AI to help you with your research, make sure that you request sources and always double check the sources because it can give you a summary and then it can give you the references. And then when you go to check the references, the information that it gave you in your summary may not be factual with what the primary reference is actually telling you. So always double check, always proofread and fact check yourself. AI is a really great writing and editing tool, and it can help you with small sections that you need assistance with writing, but it is not great for writing entire applications. At the end of the day, there is no shortcut to being a great writer. I want to encourage you to use AI and use all of the resources available, but there is no shortcut so the risk here is that if you are not already a great writer, you will not have the discernment that you need in order to identify what is good AI writing or just good writing in general versus bad writing. And so I want you to use AI to help to expedite the process, but nothing will ever take the place of you reading the grant documentation yourself with another person at your agency to make sure you don't miss anything and making sure that you design a thoughtful program that makes sense for you and for your organization. So use AI, but use it wisely because it can lead you astray. So with that, I'm just going to leave this slide up in case there are any questions. Um, we have a few minutes left. We have 4 minutes left. If there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand or speak up. I'm happy to help in any way that I can.
Dr. Sinda, there was a question in the chat that says, will we get a copy of the presentation slides?
Yes, yes, of course. I will share the slides, a recording of this webinar, as well as the grant resources from the U.S. Department of Labor that were discussed today.
Thank you. That was the only question in the chat that was other than someone early on who was having trouble with the audio.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Okay.
hold on. There is one more question. Is there any reference documentation for budget?
There may be some reference documentation from my list of U.S. Department of Labor uh, materials, so I'll double check to see if I can share any additional budget materials. Typically, so there is no template for a project narrative and for a budget for just a general grant writing template, because every grant application needs to be tailored to the specific grant that is being awarded at that time. And so often there are grants that get released on a yearly basis, for instance, where you may be able to find successful applicants from the year before or from the several years before. And that's the best way to get an idea for what what successful applications look like. Um, Often, especially for newer grants, a template is given to applicants to fill in a budget, but there isn't a standard budget or project narrative template across all grants.
They did add in and clarify they were interested in learning more about minimum wage rates, pricing, things like that. So if you want to address that. And then there were some other comments as well.
Yeah, often in the funding announcements, certain state and federal guidelines are referenced that in order for you to do further reading for guidelines regarding allowable activities. So I I'm going to stress the importance. This is why it's so important to read the grant documentation thoroughly. Often, especially the online versions, will have links to state and federal guidelines that will give you a lot of the further details that you are asking about in this question.
Thank you. Lots of affirmations and thank yous. A couple of other questions. One is, will we receive a certificate of completion for attending today? And then do you have any recommended resources or suggestions for learning more about grant writing for a graduate student?
Oh, I would say learning. So, we have not prepared a certificate of completion for today's webinar, but that is interesting to consider moving forward. So thank you. Thank you for that. When it comes to grant writing for graduate students versus grant writing for anybody else, what I would recommend for the graduate student is to the, is to often, as a former graduate student myself, what you want to do is reach out to your grant office at whatever institution you are at. And often they have a collection of successful applications for a myriad of grant programs, and they can connect you with the writers of those applications. So that's a really great place to start. The best way to learn in general is to start with these successful applications, and get connected to the people that wrote them and look at multiple successful applications of the same kind. That's where I would begin. Reach out to your ombudsman's office, or your typically whatever grant office you have that you have to submit your grants through.
Thank you. One other thing related to the certificate of completion that I've found in other trainings I've conducted is if you are looking to get a credit for the time spent in this course itself, then you can always email Dr. Sinda and have her confirm that you were an attendee, because she should have a list of attendees in the on the Teams setup. So that's a good way to do that if you're looking for CEUs. Another question is, are there plans for another session like this anytime soon?
Great question. Also, I am happy to do that. I do have access to the attendee list. It is our goal at Virginia Works, because we release our own grants. We create grants at Virginia Works ourselves. It's our goal to have this exact webinar at least once or twice a year, because there is always a need for this level of grant writing information to be shared. Um, we are considering doing additional grant writing workshops that are more detailed in different components, and perhaps even more grant writing one-on-one sessions where you might want to bring an example of something that you're working on, or smaller workshops like that that are more workshop and less lecture, the way that this one was. So yes, we hope to give this exact webinar at least once or twice a year, especially timed to our grants that we release as an agency, and we'll potentially soon be releasing more detailed grant writing webinars. We like to think of this as the 101. Perhaps we'll be releasing a 102 soon. But I'd love to hear your feedback. My email is included in these slides that I'll share with everybody on this call. If you have any feedback, or if you have any requests for specific components of the grant writing process that you would love a more thorough webinar on, please share it with me. I'd love to hear what you think.
Thank you. So definitely interest in additional workshops, and a question about whether or not they would include additional guidance for mini grant applications and or foundation grant applications.
Yeah, foundation funding is very different from the grant application process. That's more of like That's more like developing a pitch than it is writing an application. And there are some similarities to developing a pitch. Developing a pitch is similar in some ways to writing an application, but that is one concept we are considering doing a webinar on, is the difference between developing a foundation pitch versus writing an application. So if included in the chat if that's something that you'd be interested in learning more about.
All right, thank you. Looks like there are a whole lot of thank yous, and this is great, and all of the things like that. So, and Nora also posted a link to a previous webinar in the chat as well, if you're interested. So that's it.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for attending. We will share a recording of this meeting as well as these slides and all of the materials that were mentioned today. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any suggestions or would like some additional assistance. Happy to help. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.